last two topics, which is Incoterms 2010, okay, and letter of credit. So there is more than 3 Incoterms, but we're just going to cover the 3 most common ones. The first one is called EXW, EXWorks. Seller is only responsible to make goods available at the edge of the loading dock of their facility. Buyer is responsible for loading goods onto a truck and all the transportation thereon. So basically the seller does almost nothing. They just produce the goods, and then the buyer has to arrange for loading, transportation, and everything. Often, even with EXWorks, the seller will agree to take care of the loading, because the buyer may not have labor near the seller's facility. So the seller will often say, okay, I will include the loading in my price for the item. So this is the price EXWorks, but I will do the loading for you, and then the buyer pays the transportation company to go pick up the goods. Cost and freight is the opposite of EXWorks, where the seller is responsible for all the costs necessary to bring the cargo to some agreed upon destination, which is usually a port in the buyer's country. So CNF, it might say CNF Los Angeles port, CNF Miami, CNF New York port. That means the seller is paying for everything till that port in the buyer's country. The buyer will then just pay for the unload charges, custom clearance fees, and so forth. Okay, so this was everything. Seller does almost nothing. The second one is seller does almost everything, and then the last one is in between in a way. It's called FOB, but it's different from the previous FOB. On the previous FOB, you had FOB origin, FOB destination. Here there's none of that. It's going to be FOB and then the name of a port. FOB Shanghai port, FOB Yantian port, FOB Tokyo port, FOB Singapore port, FOB LA port, things like that. Okay. Seller is responsible for all expenses as the cargo is transported to the port named and then loaded onto the vessel ship, because free on board means loading the ship is part of seller's responsibility. Any expenses beyond that point are responsibility of the buyer. Okay. So often this is a port in the seller's country. So if the seller is in China, they will often give you FOB to a port in China, and then you pay for the transportation from that port to your country. If the seller is in Brazil, they might use a port in Brazil. So often the port specified is a major port in the seller's country. So the seller is responsible for all operations within their country. They take it to the edge of their country, to the port, load up the ship, and then they say it's up to the buyer. Okay? These terms are really important because the price the seller will give you for a good will vary based on what part of transportation they are responsible for. If a seller is going to do CNF, they'll probably charge you a higher price for the goods because they also have to pay for most of the transportation. If the seller is going to do EXWorks, they might charge you a lower price for the product because you have to do all the transportation work. So when you're comparing different suppliers, you have to look at, okay, what's the price plus is the price EXWorks price, and then how much is the transportation going to cost me to really compare two different suppliers. Okay, so the last last topic for today is letter of credit. Okay, so what's the problem that it solves? The buyer and the seller in international trade both have a risk. The buyer's risk is, if I pay the supplier for a certain amount of goods. What if the supplier sends me fewer goods or doesn't ship the goods? And the supplier has a risk that what if I ship the goods and the buyer never pays me? So if both parties are not willing to trust each other because they both fear economic loss or potential of economic loss, then trade cannot happen until we have a third party mediate. So that's what the problem that the letter of credit solves. The mediator become banks in in each buyer and supplier's country. So letter of credit is the backbone of international trade, and it's a document from a bank guaranteeing the seller that a payment will be made to the seller if certain conditions are met. Usually the conditions are that the seller will give the product to a carrier company and take the bill of lading and then give the original bill of lading to us, giving us proof that they have shipped the goods in a paid good condition, and then the payment can happen. So the letter of credit is, international suppliers love letter of credit because with letter of credit they are ensured timely payment. Okay. They know that if the letter of credit says payment after 30 days of bill of lading, then once they give the bill of lading to the bank will pay them after 30 days. Whether the buyer goes bankrupt or whatever happens to the buyer, they don't care. The bank will pay the supplier after 30 days. Okay. So how does all this work? So the first thing that has to happen, the applicant is the buyer. Okay, and then the beneficiary of the letter of credit is the supplier. So between the buyer and the supplier, the first step is the sales contract. So they have to negotiate the price for a product, and then once they agree, they have a contract specifying, okay, this many units of this product, the seller is going to sell to the buyer at this price. Okay. Once that happens, once they have negotiated that sales contract, then the buyer goes to a bank in their home country, a bank they trust. Okay, maybe if this is the USA, so they go to Bank of America with a letter of credit application. Okay, asking the bank that we want to buy these goods from this international supplier, so we need a letter of credit. The issuing bank is going to represent the buyer. Is often a bank in the buyer's country. Okay, so this issuing bank will then issue the letter of credit, and it will send the letter of credit to a bank in the supplier's country. The supplier trusts this bank because it's in their country. The buyer trusts this bank, and the two banks trust each other because they have worked with each other in the past. Once this bank gets the letter of credit, it tells the supplier that the letter of credit is there, is with us. You can begin production, you can do whatever you want to do and ship the goods. Then the supplier does the shipment and they get a bill of lading. They give the bill of lading to this bank. Okay. The bank then sends the bill of lading to this bank. Okay. This bank then says, okay, we have the proof. Supplier has done their part. They've sent the shipment. We have the bill of lading as proof. So they say, okay, you can release the payment, and then the letter of credit is used by this bank to release the payment to the supplier. Okay. When then this bank takes the letter of credit and it endorses it, gives it to the buyer. The buyer takes the letter of credit to the port and gets the goods. Okay. Now obviously the payment might happen after 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever the terms are. But once the supplier gives the bill of lading, the clock starts. So the supplier will automatically get paid after 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days as the term may be. Okay. And so this way, the supplier, and now this bank is obviously going to charge this buyer for the money. The bank doesn't pay from their own pocket, and the letter of credit has a fee to create it. If the bank pays first and then the buyer pays the bank, then there's interest involved because you're financing that transaction and all of those other details. But essentially, from our purposes, the bill of lading plus letter of credit are involved in a lot of international transactions, and if you're working with the transportation management aspect of the international transaction, you'll often be dealing with these two documents, and so you should know what they are. Okay, so if you want more details on exactly how it works, you can go to this link, which I think is a nice summary of how this whole process works.